Finishing up 14. The first part, verses 9 to 11, is about Babylon's fall, but it's also about the physical death of the unbelievers. And if you go into Revelation and find similar passages, it would be in chapter 19, and it would be about the great white throne judgment. So it's about physical death of the unbelievers. It's about Armageddon. It's about the final war, the final conflict. Now, when you go to 12 to 15, it's about the spiritual death. And 12 to 15, it talks about the Satan going to the pit. You also find that in Revelation 19. Satan, all the fallen angels, and all the unbelievers move from torment underneath the earth to wherever the lake of fire is going to be, right? Or to the pit. And then at the end of the 1,000-year reign, you end up going from the pit to the lake of fire.
Stealthy off one.
You get your breakfast?
I'm not eating that. I was running late.
Alright, so it's about the two perspectives on death, the physical death of the unbelievers, and the spiritual death of the unbelievers and Satan in his trouble. Now, let's go to, where we at? Go to 18 to the end. Oh, I'm sorry. No, 28 to the end. Chapter 14, Isaiah chapter 14, 28 to the end. 29, yeah, 28 to the end.
This prophecy came in the year King Ahaz died. Do not rejoice, all you Philistines, that the rod that struck you is broken. From the root of that snake will spring up a viper. Its fruit will be a dart, venomous serpent. The poorest of the poor will find pasture, and the needy will lie down in safety. But your root I will destroy by famine. It will slay your survivors. Wail, you gates, howl, you city. Melt away all the you Philistines. A cloud of smoke comes from the north, and there is not a straggler in its ranks. What answer shall be given to the envoys of the nation? The Lord has established Zion, and in her his afflicted people will find refuge.
Amen. This is about the fall of the Philistines. Not to be confused with the Palestinians. You've heard about Palestine wants their country back. Well, Palestine was never a country. People who don't know the Bible, they are confusing Palestine with the Philistines. And the Philistines were a nation. They were west of Israel and east of the Mediterranean coast. They were over there where Phoenicia and all those ancient kingdoms used to be. Jesus, or God, is going to judge them. His final act will be to judge them. We find, if you go to Revelation 19, and Revelation 19 is a big chapter covered by a lot of prophets, but you find two feasts in Revelation 19. What are they? Kate? Okay. There's the Feast of the Birds, and they will feast on the flesh of kings and princes. And it's talking about the Valley of Armageddon and the final judgment of the Philistines and all the enemies of Israel. They will mass themselves north of Israel, between the Black Sea and the northern boundary of Israel. And there will be a yellow army from the east with 200 million strong, and there will be all the nations of the world will be represented to put an end to this curse called Israel. And at that point in time, the trumpet will blow, Jesus will step out of the clouds. He will probably, the battle will be something like, "It is finished," and his voice will roll down that valley, and it says the blood flowing down that valley will be neck deep in the reins of the horses. That's pretty deep. It's a lot of blood. So, there will be that, and the second feast talked about is the Feast of the Bride, the Feast of the Lamb, his marriage feast, when the church and the Jewish followers who have found the Messiah will have the first thing that will kick off the 1,000-year reign is he will have the marriage feast of the Lamb. And we will be there participating in it, and it will be a great celebration. So, those are the two feasts you find in Revelation 19, and it's the final action before the 1,000-year reign starts. The tribulation ends with Armageddon, and the 1,000-year reign starts with the marriage feast of the Lamb. Tribulation ends with the feast of the birds, the buzzards, and the vultures. And there's an interesting thing going on in nature. And all the zoologists can't figure it out. Normally, a pair of buzzards will replace themselves in 3 years. Their chicks have a pretty lousy diet, and most of them don't survive. But 2 buzzards will raise 2 chicks in 3 years. That was the average for years and years and years and years. Now they're raising 2 to 3 chicks a year. Because it's gonna be the need of a whole bunch of birds to clean up that mess in the Valley of Armageddon. And the Bible says over and over again that it's gonna be a great feast of the birds, as they feast on the flesh of kings and princes and mighty warriors. And it's talking about that event. Better them clean it up than me. Okay, that brings us to chapter 15. So, somebody read 1 through 4.
An oracle against Moab. Ar in Moab is devastated, destroyed in a night. Kir in Moab is devastated, destroyed in a night. Dibon went up to its temple to weep at its high places. Moab wails on Nebo and at Medeba. Every head is shaved, every beard is cut off. In the streets they wear sackcloth, on the rooftops and in public squares everyone wails. Falling down and weeping, Heshbon and Eliela cry out, and their voices are heard as far away as Jahaz. Therefore the soldiers of Moab cry out, and they tremble.
Okay. Moab was a region, kind of like a state in the United States, like Indiana or Illinois. So it was the area south of Jerusalem. It started, it was west of the Black Sea, or the Dead Sea, and went south of the Dead Sea a couple hundred miles. So it's over on the right side of the Dead Sea, or the west side of the Dead Sea, and it's an area where a nomadic people live. You don't hear about it much anymore because it's now occupied by the Arab nations. The relationship of Moab to Israel was through Lot. It was the relatives of Lot settled there after Sodom and Gomorrah was over. Lot moved into that area and it began to prosper under Lot. And they were nomadic too, they were more or less Arabic. The structure was, all those names that Mason read were cities and villages in the area of Moab. Those are the names of cities. Let's see. It's talking about how Moab is going to be destroyed. And it lists every major village that is going to, that God is going to deal with, because they had always been a thorn in Israel's side. When Sodom and Gomorrah fell and Lot went and settled in his place, God favored Abraham after it was over. And although there's no indication that Lot and Abraham ever had a problem, the descendants of Lot thought they got shortchanged. They thought that they should have got a blessing too, because Lot and Abraham were related. And Abraham was part of the problem too, because how many sons did Abraham have?
Many.
Many sons had fun.
Normally when I ask that question, I get 2.
Yeah.
But after Sarah died, Abraham remarried, he had 6 more sons, so he had 8 sons. Well, God favored the one son of Abraham's, and the rest of them felt like they got shortchanged. And they all became Arab nations. If Abraham would have just went with what God told him to do, we wouldn't have had any Arabs in the world today, and all that conflict would not be there. But Abraham took things into his own hand, and he laid with the concubine, and then he got remarried and had some more sons. And now we got a war going on in the Middle East. And it goes all the way back to this time, when Moab and all those little nations were upset because they weren't favored like Abraham's made sons. Happens still happens today. The worst situation you want to get into if you're a minister is the settling of will. Because somebody's going to be favored and everybody else is going to be jealous, and there's going to be a war within this family, and if the whole family's in your church, you're going to be right in the middle of the crossfire. Trust me, I know, I've been there too many times. And it goes right back to that verse, the love of money is the root of all evil. You go through the 10 Commandments, jealousy and possession, thou shalt not steal, and greed and envy, usually has something to do with the buck. All right. How about the head and the beard? Why the head and the beard shaved? What is the deal with the head and the beard?
Well, that usually a sign of like disgrace and grief and
Yeah, exactly. The first thing the conquering army would do would make you shave off your head and your beard. Okay? And in the Bible, especially in the land of Israel, when there was great grief or sorrow or mourning, they would shave off their head and their beard to exemplify that. Also, a time when you would find when it would be done was when they were refugees, when they had been forced out of their land or taken to another country or something. You know, when you're at home, it's easy to take care of your hair and your beard, it's easy to groom it and whatever. But when you get into a situation when you're not at home and things aren't ideal, one of the first things the Army does when we got to Vietnam was ban beards and shave all the hair off our head. And after we'd been there a couple of weeks, we understood that it was the exact best thing to do. I mean, when it came to washing your hair, you didn't have to find clean water anywhere in the swamp. You just took a washcloth and your helmet, you washed the top of your head with a washcloth, and it was over. If you had long hair, or if you had just normal hair, like Logan over there, you had to shampoo it. You had to be able to dry it. If you got in the middle of a firefight, it wasn't going to do well on your helmet. And so all the time I was in Vietnam, I had hair about that long. And it was the right thing to do. If you're not at home and if your situations aren't ideal for hygiene. Now these people were fugitives. They were being forced out of their land. They were being pursued by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And the first thing they did hygienically would be to shave their beard and their hair. There's also other instances in the Bible when you would not shave your hair and not shave your beard because the priests were expected to have beards that showed their maturity. And if you didn't have a mature beard and you were in the Levite tribe, you could not address the congregation until you did. You had to be at least as good as Mason there.
That's what I'm going for.
This would not get it. They wouldn't allow me on stage. Wouldn't happen.
No priest.
I wouldn't be allowed to teach his class because it was a sign of maturity and respect. And and because it was so special to them, the first thing the conquering armies would do is shave it off, because it became not only a symbol of mourning and grief, but it also became a symbol of disgrace that you had been defeated and you were no longer in charge of anything. Somebody read 5 to the end.
My heart weeps for Moab, its people flee to Zoar and Eglath Shalishah. Weeping they climb the road to weep it. Their cries of distress can be heard all along the road to Haronim. Even the waters of Nimrim are dried up, the grassy banks are scorched, the tender plants are gone, nothing green remains. The people grab their possessions and carry them across the ravine of willows. A cry of distress echoes through the land of Moab, from one end to the other, from Elglan to Burial. The stream near Dibon runs red with blood, but I am still not finished with Dibon. Lions will hunt down the survivors, both those who try to escape and those who remain behind. Should have read ahead. Wow.
Okay. What's going on here? Shows their priorities. It said grass is no longer growing because probably the Babylonians and the Assyrians, they come into an area, they take what they need, and then they burn it. So the wheat fields, the hay fields, the barley fields have all been destroyed. There's no greenery there anymore. And so there's no grain, and because there's no grain, there's no bread, and the people are starving. We did it seems like Russia is out to do the same thing in Ukraine right now. But let's not beat them up too bad, because if you know anything about the Civil War, it was a scorched earth conflict. They'd move into the area, they'd kill whatever cattle they needed to feed the army, they'd kill whatever sheep, and then they'd burn all the hay fields and they'd burn all the houses. And the people would be left with nothing. And it weakens the enemy and destroys their resolve, restores their, destroys their will to fight. And physically, they're not healthy. They don't have enough food, they don't have enough strength. If they don't get help of some kind from somewhere, the army will be defeated. There's an old saying, the army marches on its stomach. When you run out of provisions, the soldiers can no longer fight effectively. It also is, there's no saying also that the army travels on its feet. When I went and took my physical for basic training, he asked me if there was anything wrong with me, because I weighed 135 pounds and I was 6'3". And I was standing there without my t-shirt on, and there was a whole bunch of ribs sticking out. But I was healthy. They said, "Is there anything wrong with you?" I said, "Yeah, I've got flat feet. That's all that's wrong with me. That's all that I know that's wrong with me." He said, "Oh, so you can't be a soldier?" I said, "Look, I got flat feet. I didn't say I didn't want to be a soldier." Although it was a draft thing, and I had volunteered, but I wasn't. He thought I was trying to get out here. He said, "Well, stand up here," and he had a thing with a picture of a foot on it. He laid a piece of tissue down there, and he said, put your foot exactly where those toes are, and then stand on your left foot." And so I did, and he tried to pull the paper out, and it broke. Because my feet are as flat as a board. Okay. So he said, "Let's try that again." So he puts another one down. Instead of putting it in an inch, he puts it in about a quarter of an inch from the edge of the foot there. And he said, "No, put your foot down there." And he pulled on it, and it broke. So I stood on the other side, and he did it on the other foot, and he said, "You have flat feet." Army doctors are with this. Any doctor that's worth anything is not serving in the army. So he looked at me and said, "Well, if they start to bother you, they'll give you arches or something." And so,
Yeah, right.
so much for the army traveling on good feet. Okay, notice they're heading south. There's a river that feeds about 2/3 of the way south on the Dead Sea. And I forget the name of the river now. I would go write it down and I forgot it. But along that river, there's a deep valley with a lot of tributaries coming in. And it's called the Valley of Poplars. And it's been a place where people fled to when there was famines and whatever, because there was water, there was shade, there was shelter, and there was usually something, most wildlife could be sustained there. And so it was a place where people went when times were tough. Notice what they took with them. I said,
Their wealth and belongings.
took their gold, their silver, their jewels, their wealth. What's it say about these people?
Their priorities are wrong.
I would think,
They
you
like
know,
chewing on metal. They like chewing on metal.
sucking on gold, I guess, you know. My high priority now is to see how much I can get canned this summer. Because have you been to the grocery store lately? And last year, famine worldwide was up 25%, or drought worldwide was up 25%. And God's trying to send us a message And everybody's lamenting that the stock market's down. Things haven't changed much, guys. It's gonna come, there's gonna come a day when a quart of green beans is gonna be worth more than what? Quart of green beans.
We were talking about this last night.
There you go. A quart of green beans is gonna be worth a wheelbarrow full of money. Have you heard the stories about Germany after the war was over? A wheelbarrow full of, what's the currency in Germany?
Deutschmarks. Marks.
Mark? Yeah. A wheelbarrow full of marks for a loaf of bread.
I read a thing about that just the other day. It was 5 billion Reichsmarks for a loaf of bread.
For what?
For a loaf of bread, 5 billion.
Yeah.
At that time.
A wheelbarrow full of marks for a loaf of bread. It's gonna be that way again. Because, you know, there's all these conspiracy theories about what's going on and the oil and all this stuff, and there's a plot behind it all, you know. Well, there is kind of, but it's not the plot that most people are digging up out of them, mucking the mire. The plot is God's trying to get our attention and get us to repent. And he's doing it gradually, and he's allowing it to happen. And at some point, now, believers are gonna be blessed just like they always have been. God hasn't changed a bit. Jacob went out in the middle of a famine and planted some wheat and got 100-fold return. Daniel did very well in Babylon. Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego did very well. The disciples did very well during the persecution. I mean, and they didn't go home until God was ready for them to leave. And we will be provided for as believers as long as we are believing in God and called according to His purpose. As long as we are here, we will be here in the final days to help believers get established. And to feed them, because they're not going to be ready. We ought to be ready. We ought to know the Bible. We ought to know what's coming. We ought to be prepared, like Joseph in Egypt. We ought to be doing things to be ready. Not just for us, but for the believers that are going to come along later and have no idea what just hit them in the face. And we'll open up a jar of beans and feed the 5,000. God will take care of it. We're going to see miracle after miracle after miracle all day long. But He does expect us to be prepared. Now, there's a whole bunch of people in the world today saying, well, we don't have to worry about that because the trumpet's going to blow and we're going to be raptured out before those cars. Does that sound like God is the same yesterday, today, and forever? And do we really deserve to be rescued when the rest of the world for 6,000 years? I mean, the children of Israel had to go through the wilderness. God didn't just pick them up out of Egypt and set them down in the promised land. They had to fight the battle of Jericho. They had to do the things that needed to be done. Joseph had to store up grain for 7,000 years so that there would be plenty or for 7 years, so that there would be plenty for 7 years. What if Joseph would have said, well, we'll just depend on God? Well, those grain bins would have been empty. But the way it was, God used him, and He blessed Egypt, and in the end, He blessed Israel, because the Israelites came down and they took refuge in Egypt for 400 years. God set it all up. Joseph was obedient. Pharaoh favored him, and the whole thing worked together for good. and that's the way God works. But we play a part in it. We can't just sit there and, I know people who said, I'm gonna buy a Cadillac because we're gonna be raptured out every day and I won't have to pay for it. Literally told me that 30 years ago. I wonder what they're driving today. You know, I wanna go back to Somerville and see what that idiot's driving today. And if it got repossessed, because he couldn't afford it. You know, with everything, there is a dose of common sense involved. God expects us to not only use our sweat, but to use our brains a little bit to be ready for what is about to hit us. And these people are heading for the Valley of Poplars with gold and silver and jewels, and it doesn't indicate in there anywhere. And they're begging Judah to take them in because they're starving to death. Sounds like a Gunsmoke episode with Festus and that old guy that lived in it. Have you seen that one?
Probably, but I don't remember.
Festus out in the desert and he's lost. He finds this old prospector who found gold, but he doesn't know how to get home. So he uses Festus for a pack mule to cart his gold away. And about day 2, they run out of water. But they had a lot of gold. Pretty much the same situation. All right, where we are, okay. There's red jelly on the table. There's different sized jars, and I just wanted to use up the little jars because I don't like them, I don't want to get rid of them. So if there's nothing but little jars left, take 2. I mean, you're not limited to 1 jar. You could all have the same amount, but if you get little jars, you have to take 2. And we'll get upstairs.